from us here in 5-star hotels until the rural women, the cross-border traders who are being harassed and they cannot trade freely among themselves. We need to train them. When I was chair of Commissioners Council, I did a study about what is the awareness of the cross-border women traders about the simplified trade regime. Nothing. They don't know anything. And I am sure the same, they don't know about ACFTA. So sensitization workshops among our private sector, starting from big companies till the rural women, till the youth startups, is very important. As my sister, the brother has said, our continent, 60% are youth under the age of 25. What are we going to do for them, for creation of jobs, for creating prosperity? One of the programs we are doing under Africa Business Council is hunting for Africa's unicorns. We need to support our youth entrepreneurs to see how we invest in high-tech startups that would address the solutions of our African continent. My dear sisters and brothers, Africa Business Council is your council. We are happy to support all the implementation of ACFTA together. And as I always say, and I really challenge my African leaders when they say, we want Africa free from hunger, Africa free from disease, Africa free from poverty, Africa free from illiteracy. I say, no. We as private sector, collectively, we don't want Africa free from hunger, but well-nourished. Not free from poverty, but wealthy. Not free from disease, but healthy. Not free from illiteracy, but well-educated. Together we can do it, and this is the Africa we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amani Asfour. I think the message is very clear. We empower private sector, mainly by providing with training and capacity building, building on their capacity, policy advocacy, recommendation that we need to have at least 40% of procurement that goes to Africa private sector. We need to promote Africa's manufacturing companies, product development, strong, harmonized, and standardized, and we need to process our own raw materials to final products. I would now like to request Her Excellency Ms. Annette Simueba, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the East African Community.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay, I think after the energy from Dr. Amani, I expected a louder good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Honorable Rebecca Miano, Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of East African Community. Ambassador, Excellency Albert Muchanga, Commissioner, Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals, African Union Commission, Madam Emily Mburu, Ndoria, Director, Trade in Services, Investment, IPR, Digital Trade, African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Dr. Amani Asfour, President, Africa Business Council, Ms. Angelina Ngalula, Chairperson, East African Business Council, Ms. Susan Maingi, Chair Trade, Investment Sector Board, Kenya Private Sector Alliance, Mr. Job Wanjohi, Head of Policy, Research, Kenya Association of Manufacturers, distinguished leaders of business present here today, development partners, esteemed presenters, moderators, and panelists, distinguished delegates, participants, all protocols observed. I take this opportunity to warmly welcome you to this 14th African Union High-Level Private Sector Forum, and I bring warm greetings from the Secretary General of the East African Community, Honorable Mathuki, who is unable to join us today. I'm especially delighted that my first engagement in the capacity of Deputy Secretary General is to deliberate together through this public-private dialogue and other actors towards solutions oriented to sustainable development as we continue to chart the path towards a shared vision of prosperity for our regions and continent. I have very many fond memories of many discussions that I've been involved in to advance private sector development, and I see very many faces of friends and professional colleagues. It is evident that the current crisis continues to impact the business environment, and deliberations such as this forum taking place over the next 3 days should enable us to focus more deeply and more intently through a multifaceted approach involving all stakeholders towards practical and timely solutions. From the previous speakers that have addressed us, the emphasis on public-private engagement cannot be made even further. As co-organizers of this important forum, I wish to note that the key topics for this high-level dialogue were selected carefully, noting their importance, more especially for the private sector, and aligned to future trade trends and challenges impeding growth. For example, we will, over the next days, discuss issues around finance, digital trade, infrastructure, value chains, environment, climate change, women and youth in business, among many other topics. Our combined voices and contributions from the public and private sectors, academia, and all stakeholders should lead to tangible recommendations to foster progress. To bring context to the themes for discussion, and here I will make reference to the climate and finance discussions, and since this forum is in the context of the AfCFTA, we are reminded of Africa Development Bank's estimates as provided in the Africa Economic Outlook of 2023, that to close Africa's climate financing gap by 2030, approximately 213.4 billion will be needed to be mobilized annually from the private sector to complement constrained public resources. In addition, Africa will require about $1.3 trillion annually to meet its sustainable development needs by 2030, and thus achieve green growth. These are huge numbers. On agriculture, in the last 3 years, challenges attributed to drought and other economic shocks have resulted in reduction in agricultural production ranging from 2.6% to 7% across the regions. Export of agri-food declined by 13% and 25% in low and middle income countries. These have worsened the food security situation in most African countries and foreign earnings by African countries. It is my sincere hope that the discussions on food security will enable us to craft solutions to address these and other challenges. We have had, and we all appreciate the opportunities abound through the AfCFTA that offers African opportunity to grow intra-African trade with a market of over 1.2 billion people. However, we are also familiar with the many challenges that will impede us from harnessing this opportunity. Challenges around NTBs, challenges around the backlog in connectivity, low industrialization, among others. And if I could speak briefly on the issue of industrialization. Limited industrialization is one of the reasons intra-African trade is still very low. Studies have established that Africa will need its own unique approach to industrialization. Policies must increasingly account for the ways that industrialization is changing, including the rise of digitalization, changes to organizational modes of production, and the geographic distribution of production. It must be greener than the industrialization that occurred before while navigating growing geopolitical divides, the reemergence of concerns around supply chain security, and the disintegration of constraints to policy-making space. All these issues require combined public-private dialogue. Recognizing the importance of stimulating economic growth beyond natural resources, the EAC is implementing an industrialization policy that focuses on diversification of the manufacturing sector, high value addition, SMEs, and it aims to see the manufacturing sector contributing to a rise in GDP by 2032 of 25%. The contribution of the EAC is also to progressively work towards achieving the targets through promoting industrial development in strategic sectors, some of which we will discuss, promoting regional value chains, which we will also discuss over the next days, investment policy that promotes the community as a common investment area, promoting strategic use of public procurement, and we just had that call from Dr. Amani, local content requirements, promoting small and medium enterprises, such as through interventions like the Jua Kali, Nguvu Kazi, capacity building, implementing the common external tariff regime, enhancing dialogue between the public and the private sector, strengthening capacities, facilitating development of technical skills, and among many others. As I conclude, it is my sincere hope that at the end of this forum, new innovative approaches will be forged as we strive towards strengthening linkages between regional and continental markets. Information will be shared, leading to new business partnerships. Investment opportunities will be better understood. And it is worth noting that the EAC has developed an online platform facilitating development of technical investment opportunities to be accessed easily through the EAC and partner websites. We reiterate our commitment to support all these efforts and look forward to fruitful deliberations over the next 3 days. Thank you for your attention. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ms. Annette Simweba. I think she underlined the importance of public-private sector dialogue and the challenge in terms of declining our export of food, which is a big major challenge for us. She stressed the importance of industrialization again and and the need to promote SMEs. And finally, I think we need to make use of the online platform of the East African community on investment opportunities. I would now like to call a representative of the General Secretary of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Yes, madam. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Honorable Rebecca Miano, Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of East African Community in Kenya, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner of Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals at the African Union Commission, representative of His Excellency Honorable Peter Mathuki, Ms. Annette Semweba, the Deputy Secretary General at the EAC Secretariat, my friend Dr. Amani Asfo, President of the African Business Council, Ms. Angelina Ngalula, the Chairperson of East African Business Council, representatives from KEPSA, come, and also distinguished delegates and distinguished private sector, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm Emily Mburundoria. I'm the Director for Trading Services, Investment, Intellectual Property Rights, and Digital Trade at the AFCFTA Secretariat. I'm really happy to be with you today. As a former EAC Secretariat staff, for me it's really being at home. So I'm really happy that the African Union, which the AFCFTA is part of as an organ of the AU, and the EAC could actually come together to organize this forum. I see a lot of friends and my former boss, Mr. Bagamuhunda, colleagues present. So for me, it's really a pleasure that, that we could be able to do this together. I speak on behalf of His Excellency Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, who unfortunately could not be able to be with us today, as he had other pressing engagements that he also had to attend to. So I will speak and give his sentiments regarding this meeting. And also just to say thank you that we could be invited to this meeting. As you're all aware, the AFCFTA agreement has been negotiated and is still being negotiated with the aim of promoting economic integration and trade liberalization among all African countries. There are a number of protocols that are part of the agreement, and just to mention them so that for those who are not very familiar with the AFCFTA, then would be aware what we're talking about. The agreement has a number of protocols. Actually, when we finish, we will have 8 protocols. The current ones that are part of the agreement are the protocol on trade in goods, the protocol on trade in services, and the protocol that deals with dispute settlement. So those are the 3 that are already part of the agreement. Last February, which is this year, in February 2023, the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union adopted 3 more protocols, and that is the protocol on investment, the protocol on competition policy, and the protocol on intellectual property rights. We are still negotiating 2 protocols, the protocol on digital trade, which formerly used to be called protocol on e-commerce, and also the protocol on women and youth in trade. So you can see that there is an encompassment of a number of areas, and most of the issues that have been spoken by those that have spoken before me have actually mentioned most of the work that we also need to finalize so that all these protocols can come into force and that they can be then used by our private sector fully. Now, what we hope to do with these protocols and the work that has already been undertaken is then to have a market expansion in the continent. And here, maybe just to mention that we have 54 countries that have already signed this agreement. So out of the 55 countries of the African Union, only 1 is yet to sign. And of course, we at the AFCFTA, led by His Excellency Wamkele Mene, are working tirelessly to ensure that we have our 1 more country signing the agreement. We also now have 57 countries that have ratified the instrument, that is the AFCFTA agreement. And of those 47, 46 of them have already deposited their instruments of ratification. So you can see that there is a lot of interest, even from our countries, to ensure that this agreement is actually implemented. Now, the next key thing that we are working on is to ensure that there is trade liberalization. The protocols actually work towards the liberalization of trade in the continent, both in terms of goods and services. And to this end, we have about 42 provisional schedules, tariff concession schedules that have already been submitted by different members of the African Union. And these concessions are giving us then room to ensure that then we can move towards the guided trade initiative to assist countries to be able to actually use these instruments to trade among themselves. Then we also have 22 schedules of specific commitments in the area of trade in services. And these, when we talk trade in services, we're talking about your financial services sector, your transport and logistic services, communication services, business services, where most of our professionals are included, and also the tourism sector. So those are the 5 priority sectors that we have already negotiated, and 22 African countries have already made their commitments to liberalize those sectors. And I'm proud to say that East African Community is among those that have actually already submitted their commitments in this area, and to actually also congratulate the East African Community for also gazetting both their provisional tariff concessions and also their schedules of specific commitments. So you see that the East African Community is also leading the way when we are talking implementation of the AFCFTA. Then another key area that we have worked on and are still working on is the issue of investment facilitation, which is definitely key for our private sector to be able to then get into the different African countries that they would want to trade with. And here, as I mentioned earlier, we already have developed the protocol on investment that has already now been signed by the heads of states, adopted by the heads of states and government, and we look forward now to countries then ratifying and starting the implementation of this protocol. As I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of work on trade-in services, and here it's key to mention that trade-in services as an enabler for both trade-in goods and services will be instrumental in ensuring the implementation of the AFCFTA in its totality. So a lot of work has also been put into the work on trade-in services, and we are also happy to report that we are starting the guided trade initiative in the area of trade-in services so that we can then assist countries in terms of implementing their schedules of specific commitment. And of course, all this is then meant to assist us in enhancing regional integration and economic diversification in our continent. And maybe just to mention that we do have a number of tools that have been adopted under the AFCFTA. We inaugurated the AFCFTA Adjustment Fund that is supported by the Afrexim Bank, which now we are looking forward to as countries implement the AFCFTA. Then where they have revenue losses, then we can actually use the adjustment facility to assist them in bridging that gap in terms of revenue. The fund also has a creditor fund, which is key for the private sector to get more funding. We can call it trade financing for your trade in the continent. So trade. Now, Excellencies, distinguished guests, successful maximization, actualization, and implementation of the AFCFTA will definitely rely on collaboration, especially between the private sector and the public sector. So when we come for such a or mention what are the key challenges that the private sector is then facing, and how can then the government assist to ensure that our private sector then thrives for them to be able to to have trade among ourselves. And we were just in the room, and we were saying, how can the government best assist the private sector to be able to achieve this intra-African trade that we wish to promote? And we can only do that when the public sector growth, to ensure inclusive growth and sustainable development, issues of harmonizing regulations and standards. There is a number of areas and a lot of work that needs to be put into ensuring we have a sustainable, well thought out, made in Africa standard that we can use to ensure that products can easily move in the continent. Of course, there is also the digital divide. How do we bridge the gap in the digital divide to ensure that are part of the digital trade? And here, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have the protocol on digital trade that we have worked on and should soon be finalized to assist the private sector in ensuring that they are able to develop solutions that we can use to trade better and easier among ourselves. To see how best can we support the SMEs in the continent to be some of the tools and instruments that have been developed by our different financial institutions in the continent. Able to actually implement the PAPs, then that will mean our trading or our payments will be done in a much faster and efficient and cost-effective way than we are doing it currently. So different financial institution, but this one in particular is because it has been developed also with a developmental angle that will like our community that we all hope to be able to have in the near future. Then just as I conclude, I will Those are the key 4 areas in the value chain, in the strategic sectors is also because of their contribution to the different economies in Africa, and they're the sectors where private and the public sectors listen to each other and come up with solutions that will help us to ensure that we have an integrated continent, and also ensure that we implement our different agreements towards Agenda 2063, under which the AFCFTA is a flagship project of the African Union. And of course, implementing the AFCFTA then leads us to ensure that we implement the Agenda 2063. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think the message is very clear that Africa Continental Free Trade Area is still negotiating on protocols, and there are some pending protocols that are finalizing, especially on investment facilitation, where we have protocol investment that was adopted, but they're looking forward for ratification and implementation. May I now call upon His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals of the African Union Commission. Excellency, you have the floor.
I thank you very much, the director of this ceremony, the Honorable Rebecca Miano, the Cabinet Secretary in the Ministry of East African Community, Ms. Annette Muwamba, Deputy Secretary General of the East African Community, Ms. Emily Mboro Ndoria, the Director for Trading Services, Investment, Intellectual Property Rights, and Digital Trade in the African Continental Free Trade Area, representing the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Wamkelemene. Your Excellency Dr. Amani Aspu, the President of the African Business Council, Your Excellency Ms. Angelina Ngalula, Chairperson of the East African Business Council, and Your Excellency Dr. Anton Mwangi, the CEO of the Kenya Association of Manufacturing. Your Excellency Ms. Carol Kariuki, CEO of Kenya Private Sector Alliance, all the distinguished participants in this forum, ladies and gentlemen, I greet each and every one of you, and I welcome you to the 14th African Union High-Level Hospitality. It is treasured, and this is going to endure for a long time. I also like to thank our partners, the East African Community, GIZ, and Trademark Africa for jointly organizing this edition of the African with us. The team, well done. Give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. The exhibitors are not to be left out. They are providing practical demonstration of their outputs. This is practical trade information, which is key to boosting intra-African trade. I would like to encourage all of us to visit the exhibitions and, where possible, enter into business-to-business and business-to-consumer transactions. Let us make use of this platform to encourage more exhibitors in future editions of this forum. The first aspiration of the African Union Agenda 2063 is, and I quote, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, end of quote. The second aspiration is, and I quote, an integrated continent, politically united, based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's Renaissance, end of quote. We have given operational content to the first aspiration by collaborating with the African Development Bank and AUDA-NEPAD to commission a study on key actions to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. We plan to complete the study in December this year and avail it to the Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government in February next year for its consideration and policy guidelines. The key focus of the study is to position African economies grow at 7 to 10% annually between now and 2063. This requires, among others, increasing investments from 20% of Africa's gross domestic product currently to 40%. And this is where you come in as the private sector. We need your investments, which will be catalysts to foreign direct investments. In this connection, I call upon you as the private sector to invest in Africa. Invest in Africa. Invest in Africa. We gave operational content to the second aspiration well before the adoption of the African Union Agenda 2063. In 1991, our leaders signed the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, or the Abuja Treaty, to give legal force to continental economic integration. When the Constitutive Act of the African Union was authored, it was authored by two organizations, the Organization of African Unity and the African Economic Community. And one of the key objectives of the Constitutive Act of the African Union is continental economic integration. And that spirit was boosted in 2012 with the adoption by the Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government, the Action Plan on Boosting Intra-African Trade. This created the policy and program basis for negotiation of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. The agreement gave legal force to emergence of a continental market, which we call the African Continental Free Trade Area. The theme of the edition of this forum for this year is, and I quote, public-private sector engagement for inclusive growth and sustainable development while deepening regional and continental trade and investments towards implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area captures these developments. Let me, at this stage, dwell on the private sector interest in the attainment of the first two aspirations of the African Union Agenda 2063. We welcome that interest. With that interest, we see you as our partners in a growing, developing, integrating, and prospering Africa. Your interest comes against a background where the global business standard of environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, is gaining ground on matters of investment, international trade policy, health, and among others, climate change. While we see the private sector as the engine of innovation, investment, and economic growth, we also see ESG as a core to the private sector to tackle climate change, and hence the panel discussions on this matter that you will have during the edition of this forum. Equally important, the private sector is key to the integration of Africa. Your sources of investments in logistics, which will remove numerous non-tariff barriers that impede inter-African trade. There are also sources of investments in productive transformation that will make Africa a producer of green intermediate, manufactured and agro-processed goods for both Africa and the rest of the world. I can go on and on highlighting the areas where we need your investments as the private sector. Let me conclude this segment on human capital development. In several cases, the skills development processes across our continent do not meet the expectations of the private sector, and the net result is a deficit of employability. And that is wastage of human capital and should not be sustained. In this respect, let me suggest that through private-public partnerships, let us come up with policy and institutional arrangements where the private sector in Africa plays roles in the design and execution of skills development programs in order to eliminate the enduring employability deficit. Before I conclude my statement, let me make 3 key points. The first point is that both the African governments and private sector underplay the critical importance of innovation, industrial design, marketing, and branding in our industrial activities. The result is inability to differentiate, and consequently, we merge with the lack of technical capabilities to be competitive within Africa and abroad. Against this background, African governments and private sector must take steps to increase investments in research and development, industrial design, marketing, and branding. Some countries around the world annually allocate 4.8% to 9% of their gross domestic product to research and development, while some corporate entities allocate 5% of their annual revenues to research and development. If we do not do the same, we will remain behind in the journey of innovation and competitiveness. And this will translate into loss of market share within Africa and abroad. If we increase investments in research and development, we shall also be giving visibility to the Made in Africa standard, which we have talked about, which we plan to roll out by the end of this year. The standard will be successful if it's anchored on innovation, quality, originality, and our own intellectual property rights. And as I say so, let us always remember that we are in the era of Industry 4.0, the 4th Industrial Revolution. Some are already calling it the 5th Industrial Revolution. In this age of Industry 4.0, innovation, startups, and effective patenting are key to Africa succeeding in a strong transformation and drive towards prosperity. Let us position ourselves to succeed. In this connection, I'm looking forward to a day where when African governments at national, regional, and continental levels will annually gather and sit together in institutional settings with the private sector and academia to dialogue and agree on how to move forward programs of research and development across our continent. There are scientists in this audience. I can see one there. He's not looking at me. There are also representatives of government and the private sector. I call on you to take action to institutionalize this call that I'm making today. Let me emphasize the importance of collaborating by saying that working together, we are strong. The third point is that East Africa, like in other parts of the world, have historically underplayed the role that women and youth play in driving socio-economic development. This is changing. And look at the table here. How many women are there? The gentlemen, including the director of ceremony, are the minority. And we should encourage this. On a substantive basis, the masterclass for women and youth entrepreneurship will have a pitching segment, and again, this is a step towards women and youth empowerment. Other institutions like the African Development Bank are also contributing to women and youth empowerment. Two programs we have at the African Union are Women in Processing and African Youth Startup Program. This is how it should be. Let us in this respect join hands as public and private sectors to mainstream women and youth empowerment in our policies and programs. I'll end with food for thought. We currently have several private sector fora at continental level. I wonder how many of you have attended all of them, but you are following them, including the African CEO Forum. Now the question is, how does this work in terms of messaging? Are the different forums sending out the same message? Or we cannot understand each other? And also there's the question of time management. Should we be arranging these meetings every 3 quarters? And should the private sector be running around Africa attending all these meetings? And the next question is it realistic or unrealistic to have a common African private sector forum, bringing the entire private sector together along with the government in a given year and come up with common messaging? This is food for thought. I end here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think the message of His Excellency Ambassador Muchanga is that he underlined the most important factor, which is the aspiration of the Agenda 2063. And one of the aspirations of Agenda 2063 is inclusive growth and sustainable development. He also talked about the ongoing study, which is going to be very much interesting to all of us. The study is being worked out between the African Union Commission, AUDA NEPAD, and Africa Development Bank on how Africa's economic growth could grow to between 7 up to 10% annually. So let's hope that something will happen out of the study. He called upon the private sector to invest more in Africa and recalled the Abuja Treaty that gives force to Africa Economic Community. And he stated clearly that one of the objectives of the AU Constitutive Act, African Union Constitutive Act, is fast-tracking continental and economic integration. He underlined the importance of environmental, social, and governance, which is also one of the sessions that is going to be very much interested to all of us, and that we need policy and institutional arrangement, and private sector should play a clear role in designing this. He also underlined the importance of bringing together government and private sector to play a very important role on innovation, and that we need to increase investment and research development. And he stressed the importance of innovation and startups, and that all of this, by doing all of this, we need to work closely together. I thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga. Now, I would like to call upon Her Excellency, Honorable Rebecca Miano, who is the Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of East Africa Community. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and distinguished participants and all the guests, colleagues from government, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start by welcoming all our visitors to a very cold winter Nairobi morning. And I say that because this is our coldest season in the year. But having welcomed you, I'll just start by saying we clapped when Ambassador Muchanga recognized that the high table has a good number of ladies, but I do know that some of them are representing the gentlemen who couldn't make it today. So we will give a better clap when we are all holding those substantive positions. I'll also want to say that you have listened to 7 speakers before me, and probably there's nothing new that I can say that hasn't been said. I will do my best to abridge the notes just to avoid repetition. And even if I repeat, it is normally said if something is true, if something is important, repeat it, and after repeating, repeat it again. I am particularly gratified by the theme of this forum, whose focus is on public-private sector engagement for inclusive growth and sustainable development, with emphasis on deepening regional and continental trade and investment towards the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Indeed, AfCFTA's trade agenda resonates well with East African communities' inter-partner state trade policies, while betokening both entities with a welcome congruence of purpose and prospect. Notably, One of the key drivers in the realization of the AFCFTA's objectives is the private sector, given especially its ability to catalyze sustainable economic development and job creation. The AFCFTA provides numerous opportunities under the trade in services, besides riding the crest of its rules of origin to expand opportunities to the private sector, whilst ensuring utilization of local raw materials before outsourcing outside the continent. It is worth taking note of the fact that the private sector accounts for 80% of Africa's total production, 2/3 of investment, and 3/4 of credit. It employs 90% of the continent's working age population. A robust private sector, therefore, is central to the realization of Africa's sustainable and economic transformation. The success of Africa's economic integration is premised on the role of the private sector in achieving growth objectives of Africa's economies and, by extension, creating greater wealth and expanding employment opportunities. The agreement establishing the AFCFTA acknowledges the regional economic communities, and the activities of these RECs evolve around agriculture and the extractive industry, both of which have recorded laudable progress, yet a lot more remains undone with regard to expanding the potential of both value chains. Regional value chains are essential for promoting intra-African trade, economic integration, and industrial development. They offer opportunities for countries to leverage their comparative advantages, enhance productivity, create jobs, and increase their share of value-added activities within the global economy. Collaboration of regional value chains in Africa will open up domestic markets, achieve economies of scale, and improve competitiveness in the global market arena. To increase their overall output, Africa's regional economic communities need to harmonize trade policies, scale down non-tariff barriers, improve transportation infrastructure, and promote skills development and even technology transfer. All of these key drivers to Africa integration in trade and investment are essential. Ladies and gentlemen, the East African community has implemented various policies and put up technological infrastructure, leading to lessened internal border controls and time and cost of movement of goods and persons across the borders. And the policies have been mentioned by the Deputy Secretary General. And some of them are the East Africa Community Special Economic Zones policies. Others are the development and implementation of simplified trade regime, and so on and so forth. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I am deeply persuaded today that the EAC has a rich raft of regional trade enablers and will further stiffen the backbones of both the AFCFTA and AU's Vision 2063. A more structured and cordial engagement between Africa's private and private sectors will no doubt ultimately widen trade-related fortunes across the continent. And finally, I take this opportunity to reiterate the government of Kenya's strong commitment to the public-private sector, continental trade, and investment. I thank you and wish you very good deliberations in the next 3 days. God bless you all.
I think we should give Honorable Rebecca Miano another round of applause, please. Thank you very much, Honorable Rebecca Miano. And her message is also very clear, that private sector account for 80% of Africa total production, 2/3 on investment and 1/4 on credit. And private sector is central to Africa's sustainable and economic integration. She talked about the importance of regional value chain, which is an important aspect in promoting Africa's value chain, and that REX need to work together to harmonize trade policies, scale down tariff barriers, and etc. I would like that we have a little bit of patience, because now we have got very, very interesting sessions, and I do not want any one of us to miss these sessions. We shall straight away move to our next session, and I would like to call upon Dr. James Mwangi, who's the CEO of Equity Group, to make his presentation. Excellencies, after his statement, we will be calling the panelists who will be coming to sit at the podium. So I would like to invite you to, I'll show you a place where we can get seated so that we will start with our next session. Okay. So can I think let's take our seats, please. I mean, it's very important that we take a group photo, given that the cabinet secretary is also with us. After the we will move after the presentation. So we can now take a group photo.
Thank you very much for the consideration, Honorable Cabinet Secretary Miano. We deeply appreciate your presence. From the onset, let me deeply appreciate the opportunity the private sector has been given, the recognition by the African Union that transformation in Africa will happen at the intersection of policy and policy implementation. The public sector develops the policy, the private sector utilizes the policy, and that is how we could be able to transform the continent. Allow me to share a little bit of data. Private sector, we believe in data. What does the data say about the African continent? And the data that we have at the moment suggests that the African continent, if it comes together, it will be the largest market, common market in the world, with a population of 1.3 billion people. And that really, for the private sector, that signifies the opportunity and the capability that we can be able to make. If we could accommodate the slides, I think it would be even much better. Now, when you look at the African continent, 17% of the entire world population, 17%. But you look at production, you look at trade, every data you look, I may need help to get the projection. Every data you look, Africa is at 3%. Whether it is air traffic, whether you look at air traffic, whether you look at manufacturing, whether you look at trade, at our very best, we do 3%. And yet we are 17% of the world population. The only exception we have performed is food production. We produce 8%, but we are 17%. So we only feed half of the population, and consequently, Africa is a net importer of food. And that is why hunger, malnutrition will remain with us unless together, government and private sector, we work together to transform the continent. And essentially, that's where the partnership between the private sector and the government or the public sector is essential. But what is the potential of Africa? Africa has 65% of the arable world in the world. 65, but produces 8. That shows the opportunity that it is. So the gap between reality and potential in Africa is too wide. But that is what then is the opportunity for the private sector and the government. If we can increase our production to match our contribution of arable land, then we could move from 8% to 65%. We would not only feed ourselves, but we could feed the rest of the world. Let's talk about consumption. If we are 17% of the world population, you then can imagine we could support 17% of the global production because we are the consumer. So we would move production from 3 to 17. That is increasing production 5 times. But let's look at the natural resources, the endowment. Africa controls 30 to 35% of all natural resources. So it can then do value addition to 35% of the world resources. And that would be a manufacturing capability that will make Africa home to 35% of the manufacturing industry. CS, if that was to happen, there is no African who would not have a job. It's as basic as that. And so I'm very excited to see government and private sector coming together because it's a small equation to solve. Why is it a small equation to solve? Because we have the natural resources, we have labor. So once you have the factors of production, I think it's making a decision to produce. It's just a decision that needs to be made. And the private sector, who is entrepreneurs, they're in the room. We need to make that decision that the resources are with us, the labor is with us, the policy decision maker is with us, the owner of capital is with us, and if they don't have enough, they can borrow globally because capital is more, there is mobility of capital. So essentially, that's where we see the opportunity of the private sector. Now, the exciting thing is that we have a very unique opportunity when the world has given Africa a chance. COVID has demonstrated how manufacturing is concentrated. When the global supply chain broke, Africa, we could not get any manufactured goods. So what did it teach us? We need to have national, regional, and continental production. And essentially, nobody can contest with the reality. We'll be naive if we don't run that lesson. If another health pandemic hits the world again, the supply chain will be broken. And we'll be without PPEs, we will be without vaccines because they are produced in concentrated markets and we are not part of the manufacturers. Now, the second lesson we have learned very quickly is Ukraine-Russia situation. It showed how concentrated food production is. We are paying 40 to 60% higher prices because we can't get supply from Ukraine of wheat, particularly most African countries were importing 100% of wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Yet, we have Ukraine, which produces maybe 85% of the wheat consumed in Africa, is the size of Tanzania and feeds Africa. And Africa can't feed itself when maybe we have a couple of Tanzanian, maybe 10, 20 Tanzanian in Africa. That contradiction needs to be resolved. And I think we are an educated generation, we can resolve it because we can see it. We are being fed by a country that is smaller than Tanzania, the entire continent. And we have 65% of Arab blood. Ukraine has less than 11% of Arab blood. So that essentially says, here is an opportunity. That is realism. Now, let's look at the third reality. The global focus is on sustainability. We can't move any further unless we all focus on a sustainable environment. 48% of all the resources you need to achieve a sustainable world. And I think Madame talked a lot about resources like batteries. They are in Africa. So the world can't solve its problem of sustainability without Africa. It requires Africa to walk 40% of the distance. But unfortunately, what Africa does is it takes the resources and sends them to Europe to solve the world of Africa. Instead of Africa manufacturing and setting batteries, Africa sends the resources, batteries are manufactured, and they are sold back 10 times more expensive than it sold its natural resources. So the private sector needs to wake up to the flavor and the smell and the aroma of coffee and do what it needs to do. Put money into manufacturing, but the government also needs to wake up and create the appropriate policy. And part of the policy is really implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area policies, or remove the barriers, because we need a bigger market. We are like small-scale farmers. We are 54 countries. It's like small-scale farmers. On our own, we are not systemic. We are not very relevant. But together, 1.3 billion, we become relevant. And that is what the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is doing, uniting us. It is our circle for the small-scale farmers. The circle movement makes the small-scale farmers relevant. The KTDA, for those in this country, for Kenya, the Kenya Tea Development Authority makes the small-scale tea farmers relevant. They import fertilizer in bulk. They manufacture the tea in bulk, but unfortunately, they don't pack it. We process, but we don't pack. We sell our tea in 50-kilogram bags, but the consumer consumes it in 10-gram sachets. Is it that we can't be able to pack? If we can pack a 50-kilogram bag, can't we be able to pack a 10-gram sachet? I always get intrigued. You go to US, you go to Europe. That 10-gram sachet, you are sold at $7 until you're having breakfast. Tea is $7. That's 10 grams. And I realized there are 100 grams in a kilogram. So I compute. So I say that is $700 for 1 kilo. I translated it to Kenya shillings by multiplying by 140. It comes to 112,000 shillings. And last year, poor James, I was only paid 42 shillings for my tea. Kilo of tea. I'm a small-scale farmer. And the question is, why can't I pack my tea? Why can't we collectively, if we can process it, pack it, and sell? We may not sell it for $7. Just sell for $5. We would have moved from 2 shillings to approximately 80,000 shillings per kilo, and allow the middleman to take 40,000, even 50%. We become relevant. So essentially, this is the intersection I see here today. So which are the areas, or what are the pertinent issues we should deal with? The first one I see is to try and convert this potential, this reality. The reality is the 3%. The potential is the 65, is the 30, is the 20. That can be done in 2 ways. The first one is focusing on manufacturing. The raw materials, we have it, convert them into finished goods. Look at the countries that have concentration of manufactured goods. Electronics. Look at it, Southeast Asia, 5 countries, just one region. And then they ship 1.3 billion phones to us. But they get to manufacture electronics from us. That's a contradiction of solved. They don't only sell phones to us. Each of us want a radio phone. They said the radios to us, maybe not at the individual level, but to the house. If we were a single market, what would be the size of the manufacturing factory, and what economies of scale would it enjoy? And that is the debate we need to have. The second aspect, if we manufacture, and we can see 50% of electronics, machinery, 48, just 5 countries. What do we produce for the world?
There's nothing we produce for the world because 3% can't be production for the world. It can't be classified as... Of course, the next... we can do is food production. Why can't we feed the world? It doesn't require sophisticated labor, and we have non-sophisticated labor. We have blue-collar labor. We can quickly feed but look at who feeds us. It's not the entire world. It's just people who choose to produce food. In 1960, DRC and Nigeria were producing 90% of edible oils. Today, Indonesia and Malaysia produce 90% of the edible oils. It's not that it can be done, it's that we are not doing it. And that is why the private sector is known for action. Lastly, what we could also think about beyond manufacturing is let's position ourselves on sustainability. Sustainability requires change of energy drivers in the world. We need to move to clean, renewable energy. If you talk solar, it must be Africa because Africa enjoys sun 12 months in a year. If it is wind, it's Africa because of the terrain. If it is, you want naturally 40% of the critical green minerals, whether it's lithium, whether it's cobalt, they're in Africa. Why don't we then lift Africa by becoming an equitable partner to the rest of the world and says, yes, we have the resources, but convert them into finished products on the African continent. It will take us then less than 10 years to transform Africa because we need cleaner energy in a span of about 10 years. It's simple logic. And when eventually you look at the issue of the world wants to transform itself. The world will never be sustainable with the rich north and the poor south. We can only swim across the Mediterranean Sea for a few generations. After that, the world must have to come to the reality. So if we were to rebalance the world, rebalancing the world would mean a developed and transformed Africa. Why don't we put that agenda on the table today instead of waiting for another generation? So these are the four major forces that are working on our... Is there hope? This is the global trade. 12 countries control 70% of all trade. We are in the other nearly 200 countries that control 30%, but ours is only 3%. But should we lose hope? The answer is no, because we are seeing signs of allying Africa in trade. And this is a very good picture, and I want to really applaud the African Leadership Union. We can see the Middle East, and you talked eloquently about Egypt. The North African region has taken off. The red is where we are, the Eastern African region. I think we are struggling, but we are making progress. East Africa is now the fastest growing region in the world. So it seems there is hope, but we need to accelerate this growth. Now, let me close by saying, this is the role of what an integrated Africa would do, because it would become one market. The way to integrate Africa is to enact and complete the process of the African Continental Free Trade Area. That's all. Remove the barriers and remove everything. What is the role of the private sector? The private sector can be a major force of good, converting all these resources. I'm aware of time, so let me move. We'll make this presentation available to you so that you can see which country you can go to manufacture, where the resources are. But I want to close by saying that the private sector, which I can show one or two. Look at the demography. Demography is a big factor. So there are three things that we could really convert. The first one is the issue of trade, natural resources, growth of economies, productivity, both of labor and productivity, enhancement through infrastructure, and then lastly, logistics, because it will not happen unless logistics are resolved in the African continent. Logistics enable movement of goods, movement of services. So all this will give you the data, because a picture speaks 1,000 words. But let me close by saying equity operates in just that small region, the East African community, the common market in East African community. But look at the impact that it has had for equity. Equity has been growing tenfold every 5 years because of the size of the market. It's no longer the Kenya 57 million people, it's 300 million people. And that is what the continent, I just wanted to pull this. Look at employment, from 27 members of staff to 13,000 members of staff. So now you start converting our young population into labor. And then you, of course, you create value, enormous value. In just a short period, shareholders' wealth has gone up by 138,000%, simply because of a growing size of the market. And because we are an African company, we believe in shared prosperity. 2% of the revenue is given to Equity Group Foundation. And you can see the number of children it is educating, the number of women and youth it's guaranteeing for their loans so that they can get the loans. We can combine philanthropy and capital to work together. Not the way it has been made to work, that you get the drops of philanthropic money that is not sustainable. It needs to be embedded in economic activities so that it's breaded finance. It must be breaded finance, not the way we have done it before. So social investment, look at social investment and the impact they can have. And this can be done by the private sector. So private sector is not just about making money, it's also about sharing that prosperity and improving the environment that we all can be able to do. I want to thank you. You have heard. If it doesn't happen, it's not because you never heard. It's because you never acted. Thank you very much. Go and act.
Thank you very much, the CEO, for your very comprehensive presentation. We are now going to take a group photo, and I would like to invite the high table group plus all the VIPs down there. Just here. We'll have we'll have a group photo, and then we'll continue with our session. So all other VIP members can also join the group here.